Hello. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me well? Welcome to Ubuntu Tent. Welcome to the session on climate justice and reparations. My name is Patrick Toussaint. I'm a climate research and policy advisor with the African Futures Lab. Today we'll be talking with our amazing 5 panelists around climate justice and reparations under the theme of moving from shifting narratives to shifting power. As for those who were there yesterday, my colleague Liliane mentioned in her opening remarks that the climate crisis is rooted in 6 centuries of colonial extraction and racialized dispossession. Africa, meanwhile, is responsible for less than 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions and bears the brunt of climate impacts. 3 months ago, the world's top court, the International Court of Justice, made it clear that states have obligations to prevent harm, to cooperate, and to deal with the climate crisis. And where they fail to do so, this may lead to reparations. Today, the purpose of this session really is to look at reparations as a means of shifting power in a heating climate, of shifting power towards accountability and transformation. So I invite us all to imagine our repaired futures and to focus on Africa, on what Africa must reclaim, its voice, its agency, and its sovereignty. I'm very pleased to have with us today James Gondi, the Executive Director of Terralex Africa. We have on the far left, Erica Njuguna, the national lead of Angry. On the far right, we have Mary Morrison from Biophilic Conversations, who's also the chair of the adaptation subgroup of the African Union's ECOSOC. On my left, we have Omar Elmawi from PowerShift Africa, who is also the convener of the African Movement of Movements. And last but not least, Esther, welcome. Esther Mwaniki is the leader and founder of Lapid Leaders Africa. Now, the way we structured the session is we'll start with a very short round of sparks, very short input statements from our colleagues here to help us frame our conversation. We'll then enter a moderated discussion that will open up to the audience as soon as possible. I'm going to start with Mary. So Mary, you have argued in your work that Africans must define the meaning of climate justice in their own terms. And so my question for you is, how does narrative power shape what reparations should look like?
Hello, everyone. As Patrick mentioned, my name is Mary Morrison. I'm an environmental and climate change lawyer, and quite interested in making sure that everyone is involved in climate justice. One thing that really stands out to me in terms of narratives is that being from a legal field, there is like how can I put it? There is like disengagement from the main people who are impacted by climate change and the people who are actually making the decisions. And that's where my journey started. So I do believe that the climate justice narratives, including reparations narrative, should be defined in a way that involves even people at the grassroots level. So I hope I've taken 1 minute.
No, you can.
Yeah, okay. Should be involved at the grassroots level. So my intervention is to have like a narrative sovereignty where that they shape power and memory in light of climate justice and reparations. As Africans, climate reparation narratives should be grounded on the power of its people and shape what repair and justice means in its own terms. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary, for starting us off. Next, I'm turning to my left. James, you've written about Africa as a black site of extraction. What did you mean by that? And connected to this, what does ecological repair look like in material terms for people, for water, for land?
Thank you very much, Patrick, and thank you for attending. Africa has, for centuries been this black site, as I call it, for violent extractivism by actors in the global north. Extraction in terms of labor during the transatlantic slave trade, free labor that was very violent and caused dispossession and disconnection between Africans, people in the global north, and their land and their environment. It persists to date in the form of the modern extractive sector, which then sees Africa as a place that can power the global north in terms of minerals, resources, cobalt, lithium, for electric cars and so on. And even in the context of the new green revolution, Africa then becomes another black site to which to power electric cars, to power the new green revolution, leading to a sort of green ecological colonialism. And this is a narrative that we need to confront as Pan-African thinkers in order to develop a narrative, as Mary said, of ecological repair that is African and Pan-African in nature. That repair of ecosystems has always been defined, if you go to COP, UNFCCC, and so on, in a very, what we call in law, Westphalian Eurocentric legal perspective, where it will be given in terms of loans and grants and climate finance. But that's not what Africans need. Africans need repair in the form of a reconnection to their natural environment. Indigenous people who know how to take care of their forests. We need to decommodify our forests, which carbon credits seeks to do. So I think we need a Pan-African understanding of what climate justice is. And what does it mean for us in terms of, our forests, our ecology, and so on? It means that we must own the discussion, we must own the narrative and define what we see as a repair. And that repair must be connected to addressing historical injustices, truth-telling about what happened to the ecology of Africa from the Scramble of Africa and the Berlin Conference in the 1890s, so that we can begin a true conversation around repair as opposed to the tokenism that we see from the international conferences. And it needs to be people-centered. We have the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, the African Court on Human and People's Rights. And that concept of the peoples needs to be at the center of our definition of ecological repair.
Thank you, James. I think you went straight into the matter. This idea of carbon colonialism is something that I would like to pick up. So it's obviously a trend that is happening. We're seeing also green extractivism, not just on the continent, also here in Kenya. So Erica, would you be able to give us some examples of this kind of trend? And also, what worries you about this? What concerns do you see about this development of carbon colonialism? And what are social movements already doing about this?
Okay, hi everyone. I am Erica Njuguna, she, her, and that's a great question on carbon colonialism. I think that, the root cause of the climate crisis is the fossil fuel industry. The fossil fuel industry has known about the science for years and is supported by global north governments because the fossil fuel industry has a chokehold on political decision-making spaces at national level, at the UNFCCC level, where they're actively influencing climate negotiations, right, and further derailing climate action. We're seeing climate solutions that are actually destructive in themselves, right? We're seeing solutions being advanced in form of carbon markets for global south countries to get finance pay attention to the quotes, when it's really just giving tickets to pollute for corporates and global north governments, right, who really do not want to reduce their own emissions, and further displacing indigenous communities out of their own lands and exacerbating the climate crisis, right, because these are not really true solutions, right? On the other hand, we are seeing global north countries abdicating their own responsibility as a result of the UNFCCC principles of common but differentiated responsibilities to actually finance the transition away from fossil fuels in the global south. But that's not really what they're doing. We saw last year in Azerbaijan where global north countries were supposed to pay up for climate finance, and global north south countries went there with huge numbers that meet the scale of what the finances, of what kind of finance is needed, right? We were calling for trillions of dollars, but global north countries only committed to mobilize, very loose word, $300 billion, right? Nowhere near the amount that is needed, right? And climate finance is still very loosely defined, right? Meaning that a lot of it, as James said, is being given in debt form, right? And this means that global south countries have to pay back to global north countries for a crisis they had the least role in causing. That is the definition of neocolonialism, right? Oxfam's numbers say that 70% of all climate finance so far has been given in debt-creating forms, right? Further exacerbating the debt crisis in the global south. And if you see, if you really take a look keenly at what finance, where this finance is going, you can look at some of the finance projects in global south countries, and they're not really grounded in the perspectives of the communities who really need this money, right? Did I talk too much?
No. Okay. You're doing well.
Okay. You can see where this finance is going. Some of the examples is like the Italian Climate Fund, right? They funded this project in the Rift Valley, right? Which is supposed to fund like biofuels so that farmers can get like an income, right? And what this really is doing is that farmers ended up planting the castor seeds, and it did not bring the right amount of produce to replace, and it's actually displacing food production, right? To plant castor seeds, which are for biofuels, but which at the end of the day are for export back to Europe and not for use in Kenya, which tells us that global north countries will only pay for climate finance if it benefits European shareholders. And this shows the chokehold of some of this climate finance, the chokehold of the fossil fuel industry has on some of these climate finance initiatives. I'll stop here. Yeah.
Thank you, Erica. Many important points here. I'm glad also that you brought up the international sort of political level, the negotiations under the UNFCCC. And thanks for bringing in the example of Eni, the Italians here in Kenya. Omar, you're next on my list. Power Shift Africa has come out in recent months with a policy brief on false solutions, which I think speaks to many points that Erica has already raised. Do read it if you haven't yet. But what I really wanted to ask you is, your work focuses on people power and continental unity, so Pan-Africanism. Why are these important ingredients for climate reparations?
Thanks, Patrick. And it's part of the challenge coming after a few people have gone. You know, some of my points, I keep knocking them out whenever we keep progressing. But my name is Omar Elmawi, and I am a son of Africa. I normally identify myself as a citizen of this continent who is living in the province of Kenya. And for me, perhaps to begin with, I would say that when we come to climate reparations, I think the biggest problem that we have, especially for those of us who are staying in the African continent, is that we are so fixed with the carbon molecule the emissions that are happening when that's not necessarily the problem for Africa. Patrick began by telling you we've only contributed to about 4% of the historic emissions. Every year emissions, it's less than 1%. It's about 0.5 or something percent of carbon emissions. And therefore, if for us as people who want to get justice as far as climate is concerned within the continent, and our focus is on carbon molecule, we are actually not delivering what needs to be done. What we have to deliver on is the lack of development that we're having within the continent, the 600 million people that don't have access to electricity, the close to 1 billion people that don't have access to clean cooking, the close to, if you look at the numbers of people who are dying from indoor pollution, it's more than people who are dying from HIV, tuberculosis combined within the continent. So we have more people who are dying from indoor pollution than some of these illnesses that we are considering them some of the biggest illnesses that we need to deal with. And therefore, for us, I would say that it becomes. Yeah, someone doesn't want me to keep going, but it's fine. So it's important that we really define what climate or the climate discourse for the continent is, because we've so much been hijacked by the conversation from the global north, who have defined much of the struggles that we want to push for. So that's the first thing that I want to mention. And then the second thing also is we have to differentiate charity or aid and reparations. Because if someone gives you charity, it's not necessarily that they are giving you reparations. Because the many, what Erica mentioned as climate finance that's being brought to the continent, either as loans or even if it is, grants and whatever they're calling them, they normally come with conditionalities. Examples will be places like Namibia, where they got money from the German government to do a renewable energy project that's going to be creating green hydrogen, which is going to be producing steel, but the question you should ask yourself is that steel for Namibia or for Germany? And therefore, is Namibia even benefiting from the process? And therefore, it even goes to the concept of green colonialism as well, where we're seeing even the funding that's coming for green energy is actually in the interest not of this continent first, but actually of interests that are beyond this continent. Now, the question that we've asked on false solutions, what I will mention is, if you look at, and false solutions are many. For those who are interested or have looked at it, you can look at different of them. You have geoengineering, you have carbon markets, and many other forms of false solutions. But allow me to concentrate on carbon markets because I don't have much time to delve into all of this. And if you look at Africa itself, when it comes to carbon markets, which really is not carbon markets, it's pollution permits, because in essence, what's happening is for those of us who have not depleted our carbon budget are giving away our land in the form of forest so that those people who continue polluting can continue polluting. So we are actually allowing them to continue polluting, and we are taking the risks and the impact of the pollution itself at very meager sort of dollars or pennies to the dollars that you're receiving. If anyone is benefiting from carbon markets, it's definitely the brokers who are organizing this deal and the polluters themselves. And therefore, for this, I will end by mentioning that it's going to the tenet of even sovereignty of this continent. Look at a country like Zimbabwe, for instance. They've given about 20% of their land towards carbon market. If you look at in totality for the whole African continent, the land that has been given for carbon markets, it's bigger than United Kingdom itself. That's how big this land is. And the problem is, our governments, and the question I'm sure you're asking yourself is why are our governments then getting in bed and accepting these deals that are not necessarily helping us? And the answer is that because the system that we have in place and the debt that they're they are owing to the international financial institutions, it's so big that they have to concentrate first about how they're going to be paying the the interest and the installments in the short term before they can start worrying about the long term. That's why now they've realized whatever deals come that gives them dollars, they will be willing to sign these deals as long as they can continue paying. And therefore, for us, climate reparations has to be not more indebtedness, not more of giving our land in other names now. Before it was colonialism when people came and take it by force. Now we're just being paid pennies to the dollars. And by the way, Zimbabwe, and I will end with this note, it was for about 1.5 billion US dollars that they gave 20% of its land. So you just need about 7.5 billion US dollars and you can have yourself a whole country like Zimbabwe.
Thank you, Omar. We've touched upon quite a number of topics, which I think will be part of this conversation that we hope to have with all of you. Last but not least, Esther. This is not the first conversation on climate reparations in Nairobi, right? Last year, together with Taproot, Lapid leaders organized the Climate Reparations Assembly here in Nairobi. What are some of the lessons you can share from this space?
First, a very big thank you to each one of you for the fantastic contribution. I love the idea of the pollution. You called it pollution permit. I really like that. I think that's something that's really important, and it's nice to be here. Thank you for the conversation and just the space. And as was mentioned, we had the privilege of co-hosting a reparations assembly with an organization called Taproot Earth in the US, who's doing quite a bit of work in the space of climate justice. And I'm just going to share a few things, 1, 2, 3 things that came through from it. I think for me, one of the bigger things that I wanted to lift is the power of imagination. I think when I think about the climate justice conversation, and when we get drawn into the conversation of carbons and carbons only, at the core of it is how do we fight back for our imagination? And I think that's the reason why I love what we're doing with it in the festival and anchoring it on literary activism, because we need the poets, we need the songs, we need to reimagine what is possible for us to actually build solutions that are possible. So I find at the core of the climate justice conversation is a fight for our imagination and being able to liberate our imagination from what has been forced on us. That the problem has been defined for us and the solutions have been defined for us. There is no way the West will ever create the solutions for this problem. And so I think for me, one of the bigger things was around how do we liberate our imagination and our conversation so that then we are able to actually think about our solutions. And we anchored the conversations around 4 things that I'm just going to run through. One was around accountability, which was mentioned here, that there is no reparations, there is no climate justice if we don't start with the accountability piece of it. And I think even a lot of the conversations know that, and that's why people don't want to take accountability. How do we name the truth, the harm, not in the context of just carbons, which I think is the easier conversation, and that's what I'm loving about what you're talking about, the impact of the extreme weather in our day-to-day lives, that we cannot be able to have food security because we don't know when it rains and when it's extremely hot. When we were doing this reparations assembly, we had just come from some significant flooding last year within the country, and the impact of that on people in terms of displacement, in terms of food security. So just sort of naming the problems as the simple things that we encounter on a day-to-day basis is a big part of accountability. And so naming the truth of the harm, and I loved, part of it was we had Mama Wahukara, and we love to do this. I do not believe that there is a possibility of building solutions without anchoring them on the past and without anchoring them on women and sort of the contribution of women in all these conversations. And so Mama Wahukara is an educationist and sort of a global social justice conversationist, and she said some important things that I just wanted to bring here, that she talks about climate justice in the context of economic emancipation, and we must have sovereignty over our resources. It doesn't make sense that we are resource-rich continent yet poor, so sort of poor, I use it loosely. We must have sovereignty of our resources, and so global climate reparations means not only to be paid back, but also to have sovereignty of our resources. We must be the ones to decide and begin to ask, what do we want with our resources, not what anyone else thinks about our resources. And part of that is obviously saying no to slavery, to colonialism, to imperialism. And accountability, therefore, then means naming the actors who owe the whole conversation and who have enabled us to be where we are today. So a big part of it was, one, accountability and naming the truth in simple terms. And then the second thing was around repair. So if we can have accountability, the second thing, which becomes then the reparation, is around restoring dignity and balance. And I like the idea of anchoring it on dignity, because at the end of the day, when you look at the dysfunction, what it ends up doing is just taking away our dignity, and which is sort of what we need to fight back for. And so we came up with a definition that was global climate reparations is the restoration of healthy and balanced relationships with all that compromises our global ecosystem. And so thinking about health in the context of people, the planet, just a holistic perspective of around healthy and balanced relationships within that whole context. And reparation begins with those who benefit most from the historic and current systems of oppression, obviously. And it requires, obviously, an abolition of debt. And I love the conversation that was had around debt. And I liked listening to Mama Wahu because she talks about the movement that she led in the 90s around the cancellation of debt. And I think that's important because we go through such cycles. I mean, now it's called a cycle of debt that's coming from climate. But this is not the first time we're having this conversation. And so how do we get out of just sort of the same cycles? And that's why I think for me it's important to connect the past and the present to the conversations that we have, because it's very easy to imagine that this is the first time that we are having this conversation just as a new name, but in reality it's been going on for a long time. And so it means dismantling the financial systems that keep the global south perpetually paying for its own suffering. It's not possible for us to talk about a real conversation for reparations without asking about the place of the financial systems in enabling the chaos that we are in. It's not about just payouts. It's about the power behind it, about the justice, healing the disordered relationships between people, planet, between governance, morality, whatever that looks like, between the present and the past. So there's a lot of bridge building that we need to have conversations around. And so it's not an easy conversation. And so repair goes back to just sort of sitting with healing and restoration and what that looks like in reality in the context of what we are. In the third one, and then I'm going to just run through this, is rebuilding as well, because I think, and this is something that I talk a lot about, it's very easy for us to talk about reparations and sort of ask, when we have the funds, what are they for? And I know that sounds like a basic question, but we need to ask, and that's a place for imagination. What are systems that we can build that actually serve us? If we have gotten to a day where we have these funds, what do those funds do? Who governs those funds? Those hard conversations so that then we design systems that actually serve life. We used the People's Movement Assembly, and so we had people from sort of 22 countries, leaders from all those spaces, because one of the things that I worry about is it's very easy for climate reparations to be an elite conversation that's often led by lawyers. How do we make it into our normal day-to-day conversations? And then use that to be able to design a community-governed climate funds. And I think that's a hard conversation to have, but not just conversations around funds that will be governed within the existing financial systems. What are different financial systems that are people-led that we can build that then design the systems that serve the human experience? And I love to lift a conversation that was said a while back in the 90s by one of the mothers of the political prisoners. She says, we're struggling against people whose vision of oppression is long-term. I'm going to say that again. We're struggling against people whose vision of oppression is long-term. And to beat this, we must also plan with a long-term vision of liberation. Mothers must continue giving the support, acting in to sustain the consciousness we have awakened in our children, and rebuilding, therefore, is not reactionary, it's generational. And then lastly, around redemption. How do we heal memory? How do we restore imagination? And thinking about those four things in the context of just climate reparation. So accountability, telling the truth about the harm, repairing, abolishing debt, and redistributing power, rebuilding, creating systems that place justice at the core, and then redemption, because at the core of it is restoring humanity and healing our bond with the earth and reclaiming order in whatever sense that looks like for us. A lot.
Thank you, Esther. The report is available as well, so feel free to approach Esther afterwards. But it was very important for me to bring in these lessons into our conversation today. We're not starting from scratch. I think this is an ongoing conversation we all need to have. And as you may have heard, if you haven't noticed by now, climate reparations touches upon so many different facets, right? And we have a lot of interesting people in the room here. I'm happy to see the room is packed. I had the chance to talk to a lot of you yesterday who showed an interest in this topic. I think many of you also have your own stories to tell. So what I'll do now is I'll start off with a quick question here among the panel, and we'll open it up also to the audience. And this is also building a bit upon some of the examples we've heard, but what does real repair look like when it begins from the ground up? And what lessons can we draw from communities who are already repairing climate harms in their own ways?
I jumped in because Esther poked on lawyers. And I'll start, no offense. No offense taken. So I'll start off by my own story, and it kind of builds into answering the question that Patrick has posed. And I come from Mombasa, Kenya. Of course, you're in Kenya. So I come from Mombasa, which is like a coastal community, one of the tribes there. And growing up I grew up with an affinity to nature, the ocean. My mother comes from the mountains, so I also grew up with an affinity to trees. So I understood from a young age how impactful nature is, and it kind of developed my journey into environmental law. And one of the things growing up is understanding, I don't know what's the word. Let me use rebuilding nature when it's destroyed. What do you do to tackle climate impacts? But it was not in the language that I'm using right now. It was in my dad's language. So what I'm saying is that the communities, the people, everyone inherently understands what it means to repair. Everyone has their own definition of what reparations looks like. It's just that there is this, as Esther mentioned, it might go into elitism because we tend to use terminologies that are not that disengage from the people who are on the ground. So how then do we come together to form a solution? So solutions are many. It can look like going to a particular community, asking them, so what have you been doing in terms of climate change? And maybe for them, the term climate change is not how they define it. They define it in another way. So it's asking those questions to understand in their own perspective what climate justice means, what climate reparations means. And from that aspect, we'll be building actions that are geared towards the particular people on the ground. Africa has multitudes of tribes, we are very many people different. And I believe by the fact that we are too many, that means that there's different ways in which we can have climate reparations that touches on the lived realities of the people on the ground. So I don't want to go more on that. Yeah.
Thank you, Mary. The same question to the whole panel, right? So what does repair look like from the ground? And also to our members in the room. We have a kind volunteer in the back. Luis, if you can stand up. So if anyone would like to request a microphone, Luis is our guy. But yes, I'll pose the same question to the panel if you have other examples of what climate reparations from the ground up can look like, so that this is not an elite conversation.
Yes, I think if you look at some of the minority rights cases that have gone before regional courts, the Ogiek case and others, the argument in terms of governments and corporations trying to remove indigenous communities from their forests and their natural ecosystems where they live, the argument anthropologically has always been that the people who live in those forests, who live next to those forests, depend on those forests for their livelihoods. So it is in their interest to care for those particular ecosystems, the fauna and the flora, because it's part of their heritage, but it's also part of the way they live, in terms of the extraction of honey and so on. So they want to perpetuate. It's in their interest, the local peoples, to ensure that their forests, the trees and so on are conserved So there's an African model that among the local communities around conserving their environment. So we must not always think that it is something that has to come from the global north, from the conservationist movement that emerges from the global north to tell the people what to do. The people do understand the importance of the environment and ecosystems. Secondly, there is a Pan-African struggle movement long ago, since the beginning of the fight against colonization. Restoration of the environment has always been part of the goal of decolonizing Africa. If you read the works of Amilcar Cabral agitates for the restoration of the environment as being part of the anti-imperial Pan-African struggle. Thomas Sankara himself invented the idea of the green belt in terms of having green buffers in order to maintain our agroecology and our food sovereignty. Writers such as Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the Nobel laureate Wangari Maathai, they've all written about this. And so environmental conservation is inherently part of the Pan-African struggle. It is inherently part of the way that African peoples live and sustain themselves. So this term sustainability, it originates with the people, because the people have to sustain the environment in order to sustain their livelihood.
Yeah, quickly, so that I don't take too much time from colleagues also from the floor to join. One, I would like to begin at the point of when you're looking at repair, you have to understand the extent of what you're repairing, right? And I think it comes to the point of the audit. And if you do the calculations, you'll realize that I think reports have shown every year, Africa loses close to about $100 billion from illicit financial flows. This is money that is moving the wrong side. And therefore, the question here is we need to take the time to know and see how much then, therefore, is owed to this continent. Not just money-wise, there are also other things that are owed. And once you have that figure, then now we have to shift the conversation. It's not necessarily now about debt abolishment or cancellation of debt, because they owe us more than we owe them. And normally, common sense suggests that when you are owing someone money, you pay that money back. Yeah, you don't give this money now with conditionality. So, oh, this is climate finance loans, or this is for carbon market. You have to give me part of your land so that I can do with it whatever I want. Or this is part of the money that you have to give me your atmosphere so that we can continue doing experiments on geoengineering and whatever needs to be done. So that's the first thing that I want to mention. And then the second bit on repair, I would like to mention the component of, whenever we're getting to this conversation, I normally tell people that we don't approach it from a point of hopelessness, because we normally look at the global north, for instance, if that's the biggest perpetrator that we're looking at, as this behemoth, people that we cannot do anything without their blessings. And for you to be able to understand and really internalize that, the global south is 85% of the population. So it's actually the global majority. So why is it that 15% of the population in the world are actually determining how the 85% should go? So for me, it has to be about how then do we actualize and tap into the power that we have. And one way to do that is, unfortunately for us, and I'm sure if you ask yourself also the same question, a big number of us are in the climate discourse, climate reparation, whatever you want to call it, not because we believe this is a cause that needs to be won, but because this is a career, it's where you're getting your livelihood. And therefore, if funding stops, if you don't get your salary at the end of the month, you'll shift gears and go to something else. We're not necessarily doing this from a point of a calling, from a point of passion. I understand that people still have to live, but then how then are we planning long term so that we are moving this discourse into one that you don't necessarily have to be paid, but you actually are going to do the work that needs to be done, regardless of whether a salary comes at the end of it or not. And the last bit that I will mention before I give an example, is also the aspect of how do we unpack this conversation in a way that people can see themselves within it? Because when we talk to people about climate, we really speak about not the realities here. Most of the time you will see people talking about climate, they talk about the polar bear. I don't think we've seen a polar bear in Africa, right? So if you're coming to Africa and you start talking to them about the melting icebergs and the North Atlantic, I don't know, the North what, you're already losing the people. How do we connect this discussion to how pastoralists are affected? How do you connect it to how farmers are seeing dwindling farm yields every year? How do you connect it to people who have, mudslides taking away their land and their property? So how do we connect it to them? And a good example I've seen, and I'm mentioning this because it's part of us tapping to the power. One thing that the colonialists were very clever about is they made sure that we are divided into about 54, 55 countries within this continent. And they made sure that that division is so significant in many ways, either different languages from the colonialists that we're speaking, and also each country thinking they're more superior than the other. But what they have been able to do is now they've made us to be ununified. And what this has done is we are lacking that power for us to be calling the shots. So that now it's easier for them. They'll come to Kenya and tell Kenya, I want to give you this amount of money as climate finance. And Kenya, maybe if it's a country that is more woke, and they will say, no, we cannot take this money because it is not, they'll very easily go next door to Tanzania or to Uganda and they will take the money. So each country now feels they have to take the money because if they don't, that money will go elsewhere. But if we actually unify and truly become Pan-African and truly become a continent that speaks as one, we can really actualize our power. Because at the end of the day, this continent was not colonized because it was poor. We were colonized because the resources that we have with this continent are immense, and we are continuing to provide those resources to the rest of the world as we continue staying at the bottom of the value chain.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Would anybody like to react to any of the points that were raised? I see there's a hand up in the back.
Yeah, thank you very much. So where I come from, if people don't...
And can you please say your name? Thank you.
I'm saying my name. Where I come from, when people draw a beautiful snake, you don't add legs. So as a Rasta man, I believe you have not seen flying snakes, so allow me to add wings. My name is Mkasiris Banda. So it's a triple jump in terms of the contribution quickly. The first issue is about how I grew up in a village. The chicken, for you to slaughter a chicken, the whole family will know. All the parts of chicken, everyone could identify and know at the end of the meal who has gotten what, who has eaten what. Now you can walk in a restaurant, you buy full chicken all by yourself. So there is some greediness. That's why I did us. And now someone is talking about, let's say, carbon tax to meat, carbon tax. You get a sense that we really don't understand what's really happening. The second issue is about the fish. So 1994, a community dam was constructed in our village in Zimbabwe, Berengwa. So our diet changed because we had fish. But one day when the fishermen were selling fish, my mom was told that the price of fish had gone up. She asked, what has changed? The fish are in the dam, it's all natural. So who has changed the price? Who has changed the inputs and everything? So there are things that are happening at local level with implications that come there. Then the last point that I want to bring here, you see, in 2015, I bought a second-hand car from Japan. So I took it for repairing. And I was told, I was so excited, and they told, no, we're being generous to you, man. We need to remove a part that does not make this car work efficiently in this hot environment. Said, okay, please go ahead. They said for free. 2 weeks down the line, queuing for fuel, someone came and said, I have money for you if we can give us an auto-catalytic converter. Then I realized that it's gone for free. When I wrote this story, You know, the autocatalytic converter, for you to have an understanding, is that in 1975, the US came up with a law to make the air breathable by making sure that all petrol, diesel engines have autocatalytic converters that are made from palladium or platinum. Zimbabwe is one of the largest producers of platinum after South Africa globally. Here we are with a double jeopardy. We export raw platinum or palladium. At the same time, when we import cars, they are stripped of the autocatalytic converters. And the problem is not Zimbabwe, it's across Africa. When I share that story, we are also left with the challenge of the environment, the air that's not breathable. So I think it's very important that we really try to understand the narratives, the stories behind this conversation that we're having. And more importantly, that justice itself, when you say climate change, climate reparations, let's understand if you give an inch, a yard is taken, a yard, a mile. That's very clear. Because when slavery was ended, we had it. It is the slave owners, not the slaves, who were compensated. When colonialism ended, those that plundered were told, please ignore, let's move. We don't have our land. Now we're talking about climate. So all I want to say is climate for me is not an abstract. It's rooted in the historical sense of our struggle. It's just about reframing. One sentence to conclude. I love beer. So you don't talk about the 95% alcohol free. You talk about that 5% because that's what those drink want to hear. Thank you.
Thank you so much for grounding our conversation. Erica, you want to react to, or you want to say something?
I want to quickly talk about locally led reparation efforts. And I specifically want to talk about what is happening with the Maasai in Laikipia and then moving on to Nairobi, right? And we already saw what happened in Laikipia with the British training units, right? When they burnt a large vast of forest, right? And communities were compensated for their harm that was caused. You know, a lot of land was burnt. A lot of communities living next to the British Africa training unit, Batuk training center, they are affected by multiple diseases because of the military's use of white phosphorus, right? And so there was a whole long court case in the UK, and eventually communities ended up being paid peanuts, by the way, at a scale that is not needed to even meet full medical costs of the communities living around there, right? And if you look at the court case, right, you'd see that the ruling was that the UK government paying the communities was not necessarily an admission of guilt, right? And reparations starts with the admission of fault. And this is what we see across the globe, right? Even when we talk about climate finance, right, with loss and damage, right? One of the biggest barriers, or one of the biggest arguments that the United States was using is that creation of the loss and damage fund and them paying into it could actually mean that they're admitting to liability, right? And that is one thing they do not want to do, right? And so that is one thing. And then the other thing is that drought in Kenya, like we always say, the climate crisis exacerbates already existing inequalities, right? And drought in Laikipia, right, is exacerbated by a reality where a lot of the land in Laikipia, almost 70% of the entire land, is owned by 18 white settler descendant families, right, who control a lot of the land with a lot of the water resources, right? And so the communities are left with the more drier land, and the drought is exacerbated by the climate crisis, right? And so reparations, as the communities have been calling for years, is for the land to be given back. Right? And that is the same dynamic we even see here in Nairobi, right? Is that Nairobi, as you all know, is structured through a colonial design, right? That the most greener areas are where former white settlers used to live, right? Like here in Karen. So no surprise that communities that are pastoralists would move here, because white settlers really did take the bag, you know? Like Karen is very green. And that even creates a dynamic in Nairobi where there is inequality in terms of access to public spaces and green spaces particularly, right? That in poorer neighborhoods, right? population density is like 75,000 people per square kilometer, compared to these former white settler areas, the Karen, Kilimani, Loresho, where it's 500 people per square kilometer, right? And it's where a lot of the green spaces exist, right? And so you find a dynamic where children in poorer neighborhoods suffer from like nature deficit disorders because everywhere around them is just concrete, compared to here. Look at this area, very green. There is even a nature trail there. I didn't even know that exists, and that is why you'd find that in cases of drought, pastoralists would come here. And so we have to not only blame at communities for, hey, why are we not financing cattle feeding, but the reality is that it stems from historical injustices, right? How did these white people or that 60 that have been living there for 60 years get that land in the first place? That's what I'm wondering. How did they secure that green land in the first place when Nairobi, even Karen, was actually formerly owned by indigenous communities before this Karen Blixen came and stole the land? So how did that come to place? That's what I'm wondering. Yeah.
Thank you, Erica. We had the gentleman in the back, Luis, if you don't mind. All right, Mabos, please.
Thank you. My name is Mabos. I'm from Namibia. And I will start and I will agree with Erica, really, because I want to give a little bit of perspective, 2 minutes, hopefully 3. Genocide committed by Germany in Namibia, 1904, 1908. We did a study with University of Goldsmith, forensic architecture, to look at the impact of genocide and the dispossession of land on the environment. And we went back pre-genocide until present day in Namibia, 2023. And we could see through research the negative impact that land disposition had, that was taken via violence from our people, our ancestors. And we could see the impact negatively. So they have created, the climate crisis that exists today globally. That is one point I want to just give info. And if you have time, you can go on the website of Forensic Architecture and look at that research done on the genocide, the impact of environment. The second one is, yes, someone talked about the green hydrogen that is now being pushed in Namibia. Now Germany has energy crisis. Now they are coming to Namibia because we have solar, we have the wind. And the area where they want to set up this green hydrogen plant is called Choke National Park, which is one of the highest biodiversity hotspots in the world, globally. Now, they are setting up the ammonia plant. Namibia had a water crisis. Green hydrogen, you need a lot of water, the resource. Now they will go and talk about desalination. So what impact does it have on our sea, on our fish, on our water, on our ground? So that is the same area the Germans took violently from our ancestors during genocide, where they are going to set up today. The Namibian government, and like most of the African governments, have messed up post-independence, post-democratic dispensation we have an employment crisis, for example, in Namibia. Now the Germans come through the green hydrogen project. We are going to offer you so many jobs. We are going to do this. We are going to do that. Forgetting, number one, the violently taken land. Number two, that it was Germany that has created this mess, firstly. Now, because they are going to put dollar amounts there, they say, let's do that. What did we do, the Nama community? We tried to engage our government. We tried to engage the different parties. And then we went directly to a big energy company in Germany, which is which was supposed to be one of the largest off-takers of this hydrogen and this ammonia from Namibia. And we have write to them as a community and explain to them that the community, number one, was not known in this process. Number two, this land was violently taken. You as a big company, corporate around the world, $1 billion company, largest energy company called RWE. You are here, you want to take a gain and create, like we call green colonialism. Commit another genocide. And after a few meetings, we can say today that RWE has withdrawn from that understanding to take off that thing. And this is, again, like the reparations that we are talking about. And I think one of the gentlemen put it. If we don't have a solidarity in terms of Pan-Africanism to come together, whether it is restorative justice, whether it's climate reparations, if we don't come together, and if we don't force our governments, like someone said yesterday, it is the biggest betrayal that our independent governments are busy with. If we don't stand together, they will come and like they are putting all kind of things in front of us and put all kind of reasons to say, we need this, we need to do this, we are going to give X amount through the climate change, through COP, they are calling now everywhere. This is the biggest business, apparently. This is where the big funds are. Now, it is the biggest betrayal from our government. That's why we need to come together and we need to force solidarity at Africa level to go. Our heads of states, they don't have the political will. They will be called to these big climate change meetings in Paris, wherever, I don't know where there is this year, enjoying. But when they come out there, they forget. Like we say, if I put one example, through disposition, the communities were moved from their original habitat, where they were living together with the land, where they were making use of the plants for health purposes. Today, they have lost that. And that has also negatively impacted the environment and created this mess. So I think the comment I want to make, or the statement I want to make, if we don't come together as Africans and work together and enforce that it should be on our terms, based on our indigenous knowledge, we will fail, like any other thing that we are trying to do. Thank you.
Thank you, my boss.
And mine is a really quick reaction. And I think what I wanted to lift is what I hear from Namibia, what I hear from Zimbabwe, is the same thing that you hear in Kenya, that at the core of climate reparations must be conversations on land. When you think about Mau Mau, which is sort of the war that was within the context of independence in Kenya, it was called the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, which tells you that from the onset, the conversation should and has always been about land. And so if we think about reparations, whether it's in Kenya or in across Africa, the core of reparations must be conversations of land, and also asking not just in terms of the West and how sort of your white person owns land in Namibia, in Karen, in other places, but also the church. If you look globally, the extent of land, the biggest non-government actor that owns land globally is the Catholic Church. And so if you're going to think about reparations and in practical ways, thinking about land and thinking about how do we engage Catholic Church, for example, to reparate the land and even in other spaces. So I think land is at the core of the conversation we need to have in reparations.
Thank you. I'll quickly bring the mic to my sister in the front.
Thank you. My name is Eleanor Thompson. I'm from Sierra Leone. And my work focuses on those of us who are in the Black world, that's Africa and the diaspora, reclaiming our relationship with land. Through healing, connection, and thriving. And a major component of the healing is reparation for corporate anti-Black land-based violence. Also, reframing our relationship with land or reclaiming our relationship with land has to be steeped in our own community-centered approaches to how we've dealt with land from our ancestors to now. What are we learning? And those are the aspects of connection across generations, but also what are we learning from one community within Sierra Leone to another? What can we learn from each other across countries and different parts of the Black world? But why I wanted to raise this, and I have a question or point related to this from the discussion, is that it seems like we're often siloed. So we talk about how the conversation often happens at this sort of elite level and amongst lawyers, myself being a lawyer, no offense taken either. And then there's community led solutions that we see. There are people who are part of the financing conversation, but really, there's an intersection of all of these issues intersect. So for instance, we have a continental legal framework, which is the protocol to the African, so I'm going to use its abbreviated name, the Malabo Protocol of 2014, which basically expands the jurisdiction of the African Court for Human and People's Rights. And why I raise it is because it provides for corporate criminal liability, which we've talked quite a bit about the role of corporations in the harm and the atrocities that many of which were land-based. We're talking about land grabs, and we're talking about current development-focused models that are perpetuated by corporations on the continent. But also, the Malabo Protocol provides for criminal responsibility for crimes like illicit exploitation of natural resources, which you don't see in, for instance, the Rome Statute or the global models. It is very much geared toward what the historical injustices and what we're seeing in terms of phenomena and the kinds of harm that is caused on the African continent. Yet, our governments aren't ratifying. And this is not, there's even a new campaign that's about to start to push for ratification over 10 years after the adoption of this continental treaty. So this is not about us trying to fit into Westphalian or global treaty body. Why aren't how do we work together to push forward solutions on this continent that are focused on addressing harms and going after those actors, corporations, et cetera, who are causing those harms. And my last point is, for those of us who have the platforms, how are we connecting the various actors across communities, across countries, and across Africa? We can learn from the sustainability practices and models that we see in the communities, the various communities that we work with. And one of the things that we've seen in Sierra Leone and that I've worked specifically on in terms of our customary land reform is the role of women. I mean, as Esther pointed out, women are the greatest percentage of land users in Sierra Leone. Yet before the recent laws that were enacted, and I was a co-drafter of those laws, women were largely excluded from decision-making about land. And so because women community activists are also at the forefront of pushing against corporate land grabs and bad land deals, we need to ensure that we are having them also lead these efforts.
Thank you so much. We'll now move on to our last two interventions from my sister over there and this gentleman over here.
Thank you. My name is Naomi Barasa. I have 3 comments to make. And what does repair look like for me is basically while we advance the conversation around material compensation in reparation, we must always remember that the damage caused by colonialism, by slavery, was way, way beyond material. So really thinking about our indigenous knowledge and memory that was destroyed is very critical. Thinking about our language, reclaiming our relationship with nature, looking at the role of our artifacts, art and culture, decriminalizing our ways of life is very, very important, and especially spirituality, because when you look at African spirituality, it's really, really criminalized, as it were. And then, of course, number two, looking at how do we change existing legal frameworks, which really ignore our indigenous frameworks that support climate sustainability, and really getting away from models that perpetuate further damage. For example, and I think of the empire so much, look at how much the empire is supporting the genocide in Gaza, let alone the hundreds of thousands that we are losing in Gaza. Think about the climate itself. Once we are done with counting the people who will be dead by the end of that genocide, we will start repairing climate. And it will be so damaged. It's already so damaged, as it were. It will affect generations to come. So having models that, number one, are not, because I find the existing models very, very hypocritical. Having models that are genuine, change models that are genuine. And finally, equitable distribution of essential services in responding to the climate crises. And especially among the poor people. I grew up in the slum, Korogosho, and I'll tell you, every time there is a crisis, a climate crisis, we people from Korogosho will be the first to be affected by nature itself, and then followed by state response of violence. They'll come with forced evictions to support, they call them, people must move from riparian areas, yet it will not be genuine. So I really feel like one of the other ways of looking at how do we ensure that the crisis is handled is equitable distribution of essential services. Economic, social, and cultural rights have been violated in big ways, especially among the poor people. And for me, if we do not discuss the rights framework on economic, social, and cultural rights, we'll be missing the point. Thank you.
Thank you, Naomi Baraza.
This is an interesting topic that I've always wanted to do. The type of work that I do documentaries about cultural heritage, restitution, repatriation. And I'm looking to do films or stories around climate repatriation. I'm looking for collaborators. So if you have any stories, please feel free to reach out to me. I think using cinema is one of the ways we can, ask for accountability and reclaim agency, and it can be part of the bigger repair. Thank you.
Awesome. I think this concludes our session. Just to say, we've moved from an all-Kenyan panel to a broader Pan-African conversation in the room, which was exactly what we wanted here. Let's continue this conversation over lunch, and I hope to continue connecting with many of you. And a big thank you, a big applause to our panel, please.
So I'm very short. My name is Taufik. I live in France. I just wanted to bring in the topic of the diaspora. So you mentioned companies which are exploiting your lands in different countries, and it happens that we live in those countries in Europe. So we'll talk about it later on this afternoon, I hope. But please, let's find a way to create a relationship between your fights, your movements, and ours in Europe, because we cannot do miracles, but we can bring in the topics in the media, in political debates, in France, in Italy, in Germany. So I just wanted to bring in this point that we as children of the diaspora, we are also resources to make those topics very visible and inevitable for the public governments in our countries. Sorry?
Thank you so much.
I'm just going to be very, very rude and take the mic. I arrived late. I had a crisis to deal with. I really wanted to come to this. I'm very sorry. My name's Catherine Wajaku-Dahu, and I'm the director of the politics team at ODI, it's a think tank. But my passion for the last 30 years has been work on extractives in Nigeria in particular. And for 5 years, I headed a commission of inquiry into oil and gas pollution in the Niger Delta in one particular state. And that commission of inquiry led to a report, which I will share, on what to do. One of those recommendations was to clean up, but the other was kind of restitution and reparation for 70 years of poorly governed oil and gas extraction. The big thing is that everyone's talking about climate transition, energy transition, but cleaning up the mess companies have left behind is airbrushed out of that conversation. It's something that myself in ODI, but with a network of organizations in the diaspora, in Nigeria, are working on to try and change the game, the language on transition, but also look to legal routes and partnering with lawyers in Nigeria and internationally to try and really shift what has been a struggle, an intergenerational struggle. We're working on cultural strategy. We're working to try and get a conversation going with other actors who are not necessarily climate people or environmental justice people to broaden up the coalitions that can really move this forward. So I just wanted to say that. And I'm sorry to be so rude just to come in at the end, but thank you for the mic.
Thank you. Actually, I'm glad you did. All right, this concludes the session. Thank you all very much. You know who to look out for, who to talk to, all right? Thank you.